Days before an election that's been defined by Donald Trump's threats to Canada, the words of the U.S. president are once again front and center in the campaign.
Yes or no, did Mr. Trump bring up the 51st state in his call with you?
I said that he did.
Tough questions for Mark Carney and why the other leaders are seizing on what he didn't say about a crucial phone call with Trump.
It seems more and more to have been a stunt.
Plus, at issue, we'll be here with what the parties need to do in the closing hours of the race. And a deadly police shooting rocks Canada's busiest airport.
I hear boom, 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 and I see a guy laying on the ground.
What we know about the moments that led up to it. And a teen in custody facing weapons charges and accused of uttering threats.
I think every Nova Scotian realizes that this could have ended in a different way.
Police say they foiled the plot on a high school.
From CBC News, this is The National with Chief Correspondent Adrian Arsenault.
Thanks for joining us. With so little time left in this federal election campaign, leaders are hammering home their messages to Canadians. And for Mark Carney, that means pitching himself as the leader to take on Donald Trump. But as he does, new questions are arising about exactly what was said when those two spoke by phone last month and whether Carney told Canadians the whole story about the call. After that call, Carney said Trump had respected Canada's sovereignty. Now we're learning Trump did bring up the prospect of Canada becoming the 51st state. Ashley Burke on how that revelation is playing out on the campaign trail.
Mark Carney on the campaign trail, continuing to pitch himself as the best candidate to take on Donald Trump.
We need a strong, positive government because, as the president made clear again yesterday in the Oval Office, he is trying to break us.
But he's now facing questions about his own call with the U.S. president.
Didn't President Trump bring up the idea of Canada becoming the 51st state during that call with you?
The president brings this up all the time. He brought it up yesterday, he's brought it up before.
Carney spoke to Trump during the first week of the campaign.
We had a very good conversation.
At the time, Carney called the conversation constructive.
The president respected Canada's sovereignty today, both in his private and public comments.
But now Radio Canada has learned what Carney didn't mention then, that Trump brought up the idea to make Canada part of the U.S.
This is not news. He raises it all the time.
After multiple questions, Carney admitted Trump said it.
Yes or no, did Mr. Trump bring up the 51st state in his call with you?
I said that he did.
But he said he stands by his earlier assessment.
Were you being truthful?
He absolutely did. He absolutely did. Look, the president has certain things in his mind that he reverts back to all the time. But treated me as the prime minister.
And he says Trump treated Canada as a country too.
We agreed as sovereign nations that these negotiations will begin after the election on Monday. And that is how it was reported back, and that's absolutely accurate.
Other party leaders seized on it all.
It seems more and more to have been a stunt.
I'm worried, I think, as a lot of Canadians are worried, that if Mark Carney's not being straight up with us, he's not going to be straight up with us in the negotiations.
I wasn't there, but what's clear is we will stand up for our sovereignty.
Carney's entire campaign is built around taking on Trump and winning. Carney again tried to show just how real that threat is by pointing to Trump's most recent comments that Canada would be great as a U.S. state.
Ashley, what else did Carney say about future talks with Trump?
Carney repeated he and Trump agreed to negotiations about the two countries' economic and security relationship after the election, and he said that can't just be a photo op or a trip to Mar-a-Lago. It has to be a serious negotiation. With just days to go in this election, it's all part of his pitch to Canadians to choose him to be the one at the table with Donald Trump.
All right, Ashley Burke in Winnipeg. And the other main parties are also making their final pitches with only 3 full days of campaigning left. We have reporters with all of them, starting in Halifax.
I'm Kate McKenna covering the Conservatives in Halifax, where Pierre Poilievre promised to end the federal government's EV mandate. He also had a message for voters saying this campaign is about change. He's been trying to tie Mark Carney to Justin Trudeau's record since before the election even started, but that message has been in overdrive the past couple of days. He said the word change more than 50 times today, same thing yesterday, the words appearing on signs and backdrops at his events. Polls show that Canadians want change, but they also want someone who can take on Donald Trump. And that ballot question benefits the Liberals more than the Conservatives.
I'm Marina von Stackelberg covering the NDP campaign. The New Democrats are here in Toronto hoping to win back this Liberal riding once held by their former leader Jack Layton. This is an attempt to pick up a seat after a week of campaigning in ridings the NDP is trying to hold on to. Leader Jagmeet Singh is very much on message track. He takes a variety of questions from reporters, but increasingly gives the same response. Singh says he's the only leader who will stand up for everyday Canadians, not Mark Carney. The Liberals have been following the NDP's route, arriving right after Singh has left to campaign in ridings previously considered New Democrat strongholds. After visiting NDP incumbents in Western Canada, this team now heads to southwestern Ontario, where the party holds 3 seats it needs to win again.
I'm Rafi Boudjikanian in the Eastern Townships covering the Bloc Québécois. This is a rare offense move for leader Yves-François Blanchet. He's hoping to take the riding of Brome-Missisquoi, which the Liberals only held on to with 197 votes 4 years ago. The Bloc seems to think this riding is within reach for them. Opinion polls in Quebec, though, suggest that they could lose nearly a third of their 33 seats. Blanchet has spent most of this week in Bloc territory. He says there are a few campaign days left to go, though, and if enough people listen to his message in this vote-rich province, it could undermine the Liberals' dreams of forming majority government and grant Blanchet's party the balance of power.
In about 20 minutes, Rosie will be here with the final at issue before election night, breaking down the party's plans and their paths to victory as the clock ticks down. And a reminder, on that night, the big night, CBC has you covered. You can join us for minute-by-minute updates Monday as polls close across the country. Our Canada Votes coverage begins at 6:30 p.m. Eastern, 3:30 Pacific, wherever you watch CBC News. Well, tonight, investigators are looking into a shooting by police that left one man dead just outside Canada's busiest airport. Jamie Strachan on what we know about what happened and the terrifying scene those who were there watched unfold.
At Canada's busiest airport, the early morning rush to drop off departing passengers. And then, gunfire.
I hear boom, 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 boom.
Seconds later, a man in his 30s was dead on the sidewalk.
I see a guy laying on the ground. He's bleeding. His torso is covered in blood. His head is covered in blood as well.
Police received a call just before 7 a.m. Airport security already involved in a dispute involving a group traveling in the same vehicle.
Our officers spent an amount of time trying to resolve the dispute.
That quickly changed when police say the man pointed a gun at officers.
To protect themselves and the community and the passengers here at the airport, 2 of the officers engaged with the individual.
2 officers fired an unknown number of shots. The man didn't fire his gun. Police stressed this was an isolated incident and no threat was ever directed at the airport. The province's Special Investigations Unit investigates all police-related shootings.
The nature of the call and the nature of the man's behavior could be considered possibly a little bit erratic, but I would say in mental distress.
Police say the man who produced the gun arrived in the airport departure area in a car with 1 or 2 other people, but didn't disclose whether he himself intended to travel today.
They're taking an extremely high degree of risk.
Whatever the case, this expert says a gun at an airport is an especially bad idea.
This is exactly what played out here. There would be numerous police officers in the vicinity, some of them very heavily armed with machine guns and rifles.
By mid-morning, beyond this immediate area, the rhythm of the airport continued. A few traffic delays, most flights on schedule, only police tape, a reminder of the violence that unfolded hours earlier. Jamie Strachan, CBC News, Mississauga, Ontario.
A teen is in custody tonight in Halifax, arrested with multiple guns and ammunition after authorities say they thwarted a credible threat to a high school. As Kayla Hounsell explains, police are calling not just for concern, but for compassion.
Citadel High in the heart of Halifax has a population of more than 1,500 students. Police say they may have been in danger.
I was in math class near the end and my friend was looking at Instagram and she showed me this post from the police
Halifax Regional Police say they have charged a 16-year-old boy with weapons offenses and uttering threats. They say they arrested him at his Halifax home at 3 a.m. Wednesday and seized multiple weapons.
I can say that we believe the threat to be credible.
Police won't say whether the teen they have charged was a student at the school. His identity is protected under the Youth Criminal Justice Act.
While it is natural to react to these type of events with fear, I do urge people to also react with compassion. Youth who consider violence as their last resort have been facing their own struggles.
Police also refused to say how they learned about the threat. But when the accused appeared here in Halifax Provincial Court, the Crown Attorney said the teen had phoned the suicide prevention hotline and said he wanted to open fire at the school and then take his own life. The Crown said hotline operators called police.
I think every Nova Scotian realizes that this could have ended in a different way.
Both the teachers' union and the union representing school support workers say the incident highlights their ongoing concerns about school violence.
We should be able to go to work and not have to think about the violence we may or may not experience on any given day.
The teen is being held in custody until a bail hearing next week.
I think that shows that we need more support and to let students know that they have support.
Police say their investigation is complex, but they don't believe there is any ongoing threat. Kayla Hounsell, CBC News, Halifax.
The Calgary company at the center of a daycare E. coli outbreak has pleaded guilty to bylaw offenses. The outbreak in 2023 made hundreds of kids sick, including dozens who were hospitalized. As Julie Wong shows us, despite the plea, the anger of some parents is still raw.
Sarah McDonald hopes her act of reflection will one day lead to forgiveness. In 2023, her then 4-year-old son was hospitalized due to an E. coli infection, one of hundreds of children made ill by the food they ate at their Calgary daycares. A year and a half later, he's still dealing with the consequences.
He was quite sick, and we have long-term monitoring that goes on for him.
Fueling Minds, the central kitchen for the daycares, has now pleaded guilty to bylaw offenses. It admitted it didn't have a food services business license at the time of the outbreak.
Not acquiring a license is an issue of public safety. Because you bypassed inspections and you started doing something that you were not cleared to do.
The outbreak sent close to 40 kids to hospital, including Katie McLean's daughter.
We first saw blood in our daughter's diaper, and so we called HealthLink, and they told us that we should go to the hospital and get a bacterial swab.
In the agreed statement of facts, court heard it hasn't been established the failure to obtain that business license caused the incident.
It's really, really hard to trust after a place where your children are supposed to be safe violated that trust.
Speaking in court, a Fueling Minds director said, "I'm sorry that our business did not obtain the catering license. In hindsight, I wish we would have had this." A justice is expected to decide in May how much the company will be fined.
There were balls dropped everywhere. Everywhere. It's the entire system that enabled a company to run business in a way that caused so much harm.
These were the only charges laid in connection to the outbreak, but many families are hoping for resolution through the courts. Several lawsuits, including a proposed class action, have been filed. Julia Wong, CBC News, Calgary.
Ontario's measles outbreak has surpassed 1,000 cases after announcing another 95 new infections over the past week. This is the worst outbreak in 30 years in the province, with the majority of cases in infants, children, and teens who aren't properly immunized. The disease has been reported in 6 provinces all across Canada. Well, there's devastation in Kyiv tonight after one of the deadliest Russian attacks in months. As Chris Brown shows us, the violence comes as Donald Trump pushes Ukraine to accept a peace plan it says favors Russia.
With Ukraine under immense pressure from the United States to make concessions, Russia escalated its war. Dozens of drones and missiles hit residential areas, and there were many civilian deaths. The horrors of this barbaric war continue, said Vladimir Klitschko, the brother of the city's mayor. But unfortunately, the so-called free world is partially looking in the other direction. That's likely a reference to U.S. officials who are trying to arm twist Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelensky, who was in South Africa, to reportedly accept Russian conquest and control of Crimea, which Russia invaded in 2014. In fact, U.S. and Kremlin officials have sounded a lot like a tag team recently. By every second, it's becoming clear the inability of Zelensky to negotiate, said Russian spokesperson Maria Zakharova in Moscow.
I thought it might be easier to deal with Zelensky. So far, it's been harder.
But Trump shifted his tone somewhat after the Kyiv attack, with a rare rebuke of Vladimir Putin in a social media post. Vladimir, stop. But still no word on sanctions against Putin or any other pressure.
We are thinking that very strongly that they both want peace, but they have to get to the table. We're waiting a long time.
Zelensky is holding firm, saying before any talk of concessions, Putin must first agree to a ceasefire, which he has refused to do. The troubled Zelensky-Trump dynamic will make the funeral of Pope Francis at St. Peter's Basilica in Rome on Saturday even more noteworthy.
Both leaders say they will be here, the first time they've been in the same place since Trump and his team berated Zelensky in the Oval Office in February.
The UK and France were among those pushing back against Trump, underscoring it's Putin who's the aggressor, and carving up Ukraine's territory can't be his reward. Chris Brown, CBC News, Rome.
It was a hard and somber day in Israel as sirens marking Holocaust Remembrance Day brought people across the country to a halt. Those sirens sounded in memory of the 6 million Jews killed by the Nazis. Pedestrians stood silently, drivers stopped their cars, even on main roadways, for 2 minutes. And at Auschwitz, the former Nazi death camp in Poland, thousands of people, including Holocaust survivors, marked 80 years since the camp's liberation. The annual March for the Living is a 3-kilometer route around the site to the camp's crematorium. Well, a family of asylum seekers hoping to start a new life in Canada found themselves living a nightmare in a windowless cell in the U.S.
The Trump administration has basically ended the asylum system.
Why some say the United States is no longer a safe place to seek refuge. Next. Plus, tucked in the shadows of the Vatican lies a lasting legacy of Pope Francis.
He said yes, it would be a hotel, but for the poor, not for the rich.
How his spirit lives on in a homeless shelter. And later, going to great heights for democracy in northern Canada.
Myself and 2 poll workers flew across by helicopter, set up the poll station, and for 2 hours, and people came down to vote.
We're back in 2. A Salvadoran family is facing potential deportation from the U.S. after they were denied asylum by Canada and then held for 2 weeks in a windowless cell at the border. Now, as Jorge Barrera explains, their case is raising concerns about whether the U.S. is still safe for people seeking refuge.
La verdad, íbamos muy felices porque
Araceli still remembers the joy her small family felt as they walked across the Rainbow Bridge toward Canada.
ya veíamos Canadá.
They could see Canada just ahead, she says, while leaving behind the U.S., where the Donald Trump administration has begun a crackdown to remove millions of undocumented immigrants. For Araceli's safety, we are not showing her face or revealing her full name. Araceli says she gave Canadian border guards documents proving her brother is a Canadian citizen, key to a refugee claim in Canada.
Araceli qualifies to seek asylum in Canada under an exception to an agreement that we have between Canada and the U.S. called the Safe Third Country Agreement.
But the Canada Border Services Agency turned them back twice over small differences in family names and birth certificates, a sign CBSA is taking a harder line.
I've never seen a determination before that was so nitpicky on discrepancies.
The rejection by Canada landed the family in a holding cell at the U.S. port of entry in Niagara Falls, New York, for 2 weeks, in conditions not suitable for a family, something happening more and more, says this advocate.
There's kids young enough to be in diapers in
who are being locked up. Teníamos 4 camitas.
Araceli draws the cell that held her, her common-law husband, and 2 daughters, aged 14 and 4 years old. No windows, they slept on cots.
Y aquí estaba el baño.
The toilet and sink behind a low wall.
The Trump administration has basically ended the asylum system.
This lawmaker says Canada should know the U.S. is no longer a safe place for asylum seekers.
It's not a safe situation. It's extraordinary.
Araceli's family, while still in the U.S., is now separated. She has a hearing scheduled for Christmas Eve. Free, but living with fear she could be deported to El Salvador at any moment, while her husband, in immigration custody, could face that fate in May at his scheduled hearing. The family's asylum claim rejection is being appealed with the Federal Court of Canada. Adrian?
And Jorge, how often are people turned away by Canada ending up like this?
We're hearing about it more and more, and advocates say that this has never happened before along the northern border. We're told people have been held at ports of entry in Detroit, Buffalo, and Champlain, New York, near the border with Quebec. Now, the U.S. government's own guidelines say they should make every effort never to hold anyone longer than 72 hours at a port of entry. Adrian?
All right, more to come on this. Jorge Barrera in Ottawa tonight. Thank you. As crowds continue to descend on Vatican City to bid a final farewell to Pope Francis, the pontiff is being fondly remembered by some of the city's most vulnerable. How Francis touched the lives of those living in poverty. That's next. After the break, Rosie's here with that issue. Hello.
Hey, Adrian. Tonight, we're going to talk about the platforms that the parties have finally released.
So Mr. Carney has the same Liberal MPs, same Liberal ministers, same Liberal platform.
Pierre Poilievre demonstrated once again that he has no plan to stand up to President Trump.
So how do those costed platforms measure up, and what can we learn about each party's vision for the country just days before the election? Chantal, Althea, and Andrew join me to talk about that and more.
Lines snake through Vatican City again today. Mourners waiting hours to say goodbye to Pope Francis, who died on Easter Monday. He's lying in state until Friday night. More than 90,000 people have already attended the visitation. The funeral is set for Saturday. Now, before Pope Francis's burial, some of Italy's most vulnerable will pay their respects and honor his lifelong dedication to helping others. Briar Stewart is in Rome, hearing from those who found shelter thanks to his compassion.
Just steps from the crowds in the iconic pillars of St. Peter's Square, a much smaller group has gathered outside of Palazzo Migliori, a shelter that welcomes some of Rome's needy every night. It was set up in the shadows of the Vatican by Pope Francis in 2019.
Many people, they wanted just this place to be a hotel because it's clear why. But he said, yes, it would be a hotel, but for the poor, not for the rich.
A few dozen people stay here every night, all of them with nowhere else to go. In Rome, more than 22,000 people are facing homelessness, often sleeping on the street. Giovanni Catalinellu slept under a bridge before moving here 2 weeks ago. He says when he found out the Pope died, he couldn't stop staring out the window, looking across at St. Peter's Square. It didn't matter about someone's race, he said. All of us he treated with respect. On the walls of the shelter are photos of Pope Francis when he visited in 2019. He inaugurated the building and stopped by during dinner. On this night, volunteers and staff worked to prepare a communal meal, served to residents who say this place has become like a home. Throughout his 12 years as Pope, Francis advocated for the most vulnerable, and every year he hosted a lunch at the Vatican for hundreds living in poverty. That's where Fabrizio Salvati met him.
I told him, thank you so much for all you do for the poor.
And it will be some of Rome's most vulnerable who will get a final chance to pay their respects. They will be lining the steps at the Basilica, where the Pope will be interred on Saturday. Briar Stewart, CBC News, Rome.
CBC News will have full coverage of the Pope's funeral on Saturday, hosted by Heather Hiscox at the Vatican. You can catch that anywhere you watch CBC News starting at 3 a.m. Eastern. All right, time now to dig deeper into the stories shaping our world. Rosie's here with At Issue just days before a historic election.
At issue tonight, party platforms. The federal parties have finally released their costed platforms and promptly began to attack their opponents' plans for the country.
Mr. Carney has the same Liberal MPs, same Liberal ministers, same Liberal platform.
We didn't play fiscal tricks with phantom growth and dynamic accounting in order to massage the numbers.
What's to be made of each party's vision for the country, and will these platforms in any way influence how Canadians vote? I'm Rosemary Barton, here to break it all down tonight. Chantal Hébert, Andrew Coyne, and Althea Raj. Nice to see you all. I know that these platforms were released late. I know that we don't necessarily think that they're going to make a big difference here, but there are lots of Canadians who still haven't voted. So I do want to get a general sense of what you made of them. Andrew, why don't I start with you?
Well, they're late, first of all, which means that very few people will see them. As often is the case in elections, on some of the biggest issues, on defense, on immigration, on housing, on pipelines, they've minimized their differences. They're not exactly the same, but they're close enough that they'd be hard to really either party to either win or lose on those issues. There's similarly varying degrees of fecklessness on the deficits. I mean, the Liberals are running extraordinary deficits in the $60 billion, $55 billion range for 4 years. The Tories' deficits are half that size, but some of that difference is made up by basically, fantasy revenue projections that may or may not materialize. Mind you, that some of the Liberal spending cuts are the same thing. It's just kind of a lot of hand-waving about productivity. But neither of them are really taking seriously the fiscal situation, particularly if we're heading into a recession. So to be talking about these kinds of deficits without having even taken that into account is not exactly the kind of responsibility we'd like to see. And the biggest missing issue is growth. We already had a growth crisis in this country before Donald Trump came along. We had declining per capita GDP. We have a really serious need to get growth up short-term and long if we're going to resist some of the chaos and anarchy that he's causing in the global economy. We need to get our growth rate up to be able to withstand that. And there's very little of any kind of serious growth proposals. There's things that they talk about as boosting growth, like the conservative thing on capital gains tax, but nothing that would really move the needle on a $3 trillion economy very much. So they're late, mostly the same, and quite disappointing on some of the biggest issues.
What Andrew's talking about there with the Conservatives is they take some things and project growth from doing things like canceling the C-69, what they call the anti-pipeline bill. Whether how they calculate that, whether you should, I think is up for debate, but that's part of how they get to where they are. Althea, what do you make of what you saw this over the past week or so?
Well, in the example that you gave and what's peppered throughout their costing platform is that you're not comparing apples to apples. You're comparing apples to oranges, because the Conservatives tell you, well, part of the way that we're going to get revenue is we're going to build houses. And for every house that we build, we're going to get a certain amount of money because that's going to generate economic activity. And those construction workers are going to go to Tim Hortons, and that person's going to go out shopping at Walmart. And here we're going to have more money in government coffers. The Liberals don't do that in their platform. So we shouldn't be comparing their numbers to the Liberals' numbers, because we're not comparing the same thing. That being said, I agree with everything Andrew said. I think that there's not enough emphasis on economic growth and things that would generate economic growth and productivity in the economy. I also think that there is a lack of prudency. None of the parties have a kind of rainy day fund saved. But I think they're basically saying to us that, one, they don't think that budgets really matter. They don't think people are going to use the platform to vote. And maybe they don't want people to use the platform to vote. I mean, you look back at Mr. Poilievre's own announcement, which came after advance voting had finished. And when he announced his platform, he also dug up this report that had been written by kind of a futuristic think tank arm of the government that's supposed to do doomsday scenarios of how public servants can plan for things. And he decided he wanted to talk more about that than his own platform. And I think both the Liberals and the Conservatives want to make this a leadership issue, and they've decided platforms don't matter.
Chantal?
Okay, where to start? Well, I'm not going to repeat any of those points. I don't disagree with any of them in any event. But if the Conservatives lose on Monday, at least you will be left with a scrapbook of Pierre Poilievre's best shots, because 30 pages of platform come with 17 pictures of Pierre Poilievre in various incarnations
and his
as
wife.
leader.
And his wife, yeah.
And yeah, I think 5 more. But so you will be left at least with a picture book, a scrapbook, a souvenir. But that being said, I understand totally that there were people who were concerned and believed that we should have had those platforms in time for the debates. I'm not one of those persons. Why? Because I believe that what they showed us are roadmaps to nowhere. They just put an X in their box. But to have had debates based on the kinds of numbers and the work that went into those costed platforms would have been actually misleading and a waste of voters' time. I think if you use either of those as a roadmap to the next 4 years, then you're on a trip to nowhere. And in part because they paid very little attention to those platforms, but also because they don't know where they will be in 3 months. The Quebec government brought in a budget, not a platform, a budget a few weeks ago. And now it's off because the Quebec's credit rating has been revived, and we may be going into a global recession. I mean, the notion that you should take these documents, and by the way, outside of journalists, no one has mentioned them to me over the past week. And I think that's probably wiser than anything else on the part of voters.
Go ahead, Andrew, then I'll,
Okay, look, there's a lot of truth in that. Any prime minister, oftentimes the biggest things they're dealing with are things they never planned for, never predicted. That's true. But platforms can also give you some indication of a party's values, its priorities, what things it really thinks are important, et cetera. I think the biggest missed opportunity here is for the Conservatives. As long as this election is about leadership, they lose. It's very clear that Poilievre does not poll as well as his party, does not poll certainly as well as Mark Carney does. And so it's mystifying to me why, I mean, when you talk about this, Conservatives will complain, well, Mark Carney copied all our policies. That's true to an extent, but if you're trying to differentiate yourself, if you see it as your goal to differentiate yourself, then your job is to go where the Liberals can't go. Your job is to mark out territory that you think you can win on, that the Liberals can't simply imitate because of problems with their base.
Right, but they have done some of, well, they have done some of that, just to push back. Canceling the EV tax credit today, making encampments illegal yesterday.
But that's on the print.
You're not going to win elections on those.
No, but that's my point, is that's where we're at the end of this campaign. Those are the policy planks they're putting out to differentiate themselves.
For example, how hard would it have been for them to actually propose a balanced budget? How hard would it have been for them to propose real significant tax cuts rather than just crowd pleasers? They didn't do that, and as a result, their platforms look much the same, and as a result, people are going to make up their mind on the basis of leadership.
Okay, again, though, I do think there are differences. People may not look at them, but there's no plan to fight climate change in the Conservative plan. There is in the Liberal plan. You may not think it's enough, but it is there. Althea.
Okay, so I would say I agree with both you and Andrew.
I'll be quiet now.
I do think, to Chantal's point, like taking the fiscal costing aside, I think if the platforms had been released at the outset of the campaign, it would have done the candidates a great deal of service, so they would have had something to talk about at the doors. And the differences between the political parties would have been more stark, because we started off with the parties proposing a middle-class tax cut. Then they started talking about home building plans that were very similar. Then they talked about defense plans that were very similar. And so we didn't have a discussion about, well, do Canadians want to have referendums every time the government wants to increase tax revenue? Do we want to have stronger climate action, or do we think that we should be going in a completely different direction? I think the differences between the parties' offering would have been much starker. And I do think that I agree with Andrew on the values thing. I don't think platforms don't matter. I think they do give an indication of how you would govern, even if we don't believe any of your math.
Okay, Chantal?
Yeah, but it wasn't platforms I was objecting to. I think we knew what those platforms were. It's the costed platform exercise.
But I don't think we did know what the platforms were, because the Conservatives announced stuff in their platform that they hadn't talked to Canadians about before.
Okay, Chantal.
But it was mostly material on the side. I mean, I'm happy to know that the Conservatives think that the civil service should be filled with people who don't have more than high school education, that we're wasting talent by having people with diplomas in the civil service. But that is not a very central point. It's more kind of a vote getter to go to your brand. Look, both of them, but in particular the Conservative platform, was more of a political advertisement than a platform and a seriously costed one. And should be treated as such. I don't believe that document would have made the campaign more serious and more grounded if it had been presented before. And when you're proud of a platform and you've had 2 years to think that you're going to become the government, you want to spend at least half an hour answering real questions about it, which did not happen. So don't ask me to have a serious conversation about something unserious.
20 seconds, Andrew. Yep.
Again, it suggests that they were locked into their initial plan when they were up 25 points in the polls, which would be to run a front-runner campaign. And maybe they thought they could get through the campaign without releasing a platform. But suddenly they're in a very different campaign, and it looks like they drafted this thing between flights.
Okay, we're going to take a pause there. That was good. And maybe the platforms will matter just because of that conversation. When we come back, we'll take a look at the party's strategies heading into this last week. What provinces are the parties going to? What does that tell us about where they see potential wins and losses? That's next. At issue, the path to victory. With less than a week till Election Day, the parties are making their final pitches to Canadians and hitting some key battlegrounds to do it.
The biggest thing in this election is who's going to stand up to President Trump.
You know, why vote for New Democrats in this election? I'll tell you why. Because when we have power, we use it for you.
Because this election comes down to one word only: change. Change.
So what does a path to victory look like for each party, and what do they need to do to make this a successful election for them? Let's bring everybody back. Chantal, Andrew, Althea. Chantal, how about let's start with you. I mean, I've included Jagmeet Singh. Jagmeet Singh and Yves-François Blanchet are pretty clear that they are not winning the election, even publicly.
I don't think the Bloc ever wanted to win an election, so we put that to rest. But both of them are in some amount of trouble. And why am I saying that? Because they're spending the last days of the campaign basically trying to defend territory that they owned as a result of the last election. So clearly, they're trying to limit losses. That's particularly, but not exclusively, true of the NDP. I believe that the Liberals believe that they're spending the next few days hunting a majority rather than a victory, that they are in a good position to win, but they would really like to win big enough to have a majority. So they are on the offensive. And I think that the Conservatives, I have a harder time to follow their path, because to have a rally in Saskatoon for Pierre Poilievre in the dying days of the campaign sounds odd, in the sense that normally the Conservatives, if they're going to win, do not need to be trying to get support in Saskatchewan, which they usually win. So I think they're trying to make gains at the expense of the NDP and BC, but I'm not sure that their game plan reflects a winning campaign at this point, especially not with this notion that possibly, and I'm not sure I believe that, Pierre Poilievre's own riding is in play. That's never a good sign, those end-of-campaign stories.
Well, I think the Conservatives had not been to Saskatchewan, so they were just kind of going to tick that box. But I take your point. And Althea, you're in Winnipeg, where Mr. Carney will be later, which I think speaks to what Chantal is saying about trying to pick off seats.
Yeah, I mean, basically there's two scenarios at the end of the week. You're either like trying to protect the furniture, or you're in aggressive mode. And what we're seeing is the NDP and the Conservatives are trying to protect their seats. And even if they're, like, I know last night the Conservative leader was in a riding that they're hoping Sean Fraser loses, the Liberals' former cabinet minister. But I think Mr. Poilievre was really there to try to protect Rick Perkins, for example, try to protect some of the seats that they already have in Nova Scotia. So even though the specific riding where they may be holding their event, that may not actually tell you the exact story. I think it's the region that they're going and why they're going there.
Yeah, good point.
I don't remember being on a Conservative campaign in the last week where we went to, like, Saskatchewan or Alberta, frankly. So to me, it's interesting that they're...
Stephen Harper, at the end, okay.
Well, at the end, because he had a Calgary seat. But I mean, like, in terms of actual campaigning. No, I don't remember
because
that.
they believed they had won, and they spent a week going around in circles in their own territory. They lost.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's what's happening here, but Althea,
Yeah, no, I don't think so. The pathway for Mr. Poilievre to win is to do a lot better than expected in Atlantic Canada, to pick up a ton of seats in the GTA. Without that, there's no hope. And to do three-way races in British Columbia. The Liberals are hoping to win Bloc Québécois seats in Quebec. They're hoping to do even better than they're currently doing in the GTA. They're hoping to have a foothold, and I think that's why the rally in Saskatchewan tonight for Mr. Poilievre. They're hoping to have a foothold in Saskatchewan and to have a greater foothold in Alberta so that they have legitimacy when they talk about Western issues. I think that's really important to them, and frankly, it's probably important to the country, so that you're not feeling like there's one part of the country that's completely excluded from the government in the conversation. And then in British Columbia, there is a ton of potential seats that could flip, especially because the NDP is very competitive in British Columbia still. And so you have progressives who are not sure who to vote for, whether they're voting Liberal in some riding or New Democrat in others, and Conservatives could win them.
Andrew.
The weird thing is, if you look at the public polls, there really has been some narrowing. I think the average now is in the sort of 3 to 5% range, when it was before it was in 8 or even 10%. And yet, if you look at the betting markets on this, the chances of a Liberal victory, a Liberal majority even, have been going up. And I think the way you square those two is that they're running out of time.
Yes.
I do think since the Conservatives settled on this pure kind of change message, they've got an assist from Donald Trump having faded to some extent from view, although he popped up again yesterday. But the sort of change message seems to have resonated a little bit with some small number of voters. Perhaps if the election were another 2 or 3 weeks longer, they might have more of a chance. At this point, I think the best they can hope for is to hold the Liberals to a minority. But yeah, when you see Pierre Poilievre in Saskatoon in the last week of a campaign, it doesn't augur well. I think some of the Liberal hopes, at one point in the polls, you could say they looked like they were going to get up to maybe 40 seats in the West, which would be the best they had done, certainly since 1968, maybe going back to the 50s. It's probably not going to be that anymore, but when you see people like Preston Manning trying to claim if the Liberals are elected, it means you're going to give a huge boost to Western separatism, I think that's hard to square with improved numbers for the Liberals across the West. Basically, they're looking at over 40% of the vote in BC, maybe as much as 30% of the vote in Alberta, which would be unheard of for a long time. So, from a national unity perspective, that's better. But I think the question is going to be whether it's a majority or minority.
Okay, I got to leave it there. I will see you Monday in person. Thank you for this. We're going to continue a little bit this conversation and talk about whether party leaders, as we alluded to there, will win their own ridings. Catch that on YouTube or the At Issue podcast. Now back to Adrienne, who, of course, is also in Toronto.
All right, thanks, Rosie. Up next, poll workers in Yukon get creative.
I was just told they had decided to open a poll across river as a sort of a last chance to vote for people who can't cross.
What it took to ensure everyone got to cast their early ballots. So this is quite cool. That is Gabrielle Skaga, a polling station supervisor in Dawson City, Yukon, taking, shall we say, the scenic route to work. So she is on her way to set up a voting booth in West Dawson to give everyone a chance there to vote early. But in an area where people rely on an ice road, that's not always easy. So what it took is our moment.
So the Yukon government issued a notice that they were closing the ice road officially. They deemed it unsafe. I've been across river now for about 21 years. It just depends on the weather. This was a little bit early, so I was just told they had decided to open a poll across river as a sort of a last chance to vote for people who can't cross. And then myself and 2 poll workers flew across by helicopter, set up the poll station, and for 2 hours, and people came down to vote. And then the 2 poll workers I was with had never been in a helicopter, so I gave them the front seat, and they just loved it. So I had someone bring the truck down, and we just set it up so that it was facing the river in a sort of more private sort of side of it. Put up the screen so people could mark their ballots. It's right on the bank of the Yukon River. It was just with a nice view of town. It was just a lovely, lovely, couldn't have been better. You know, it was kind of unique, although we're kind of used to odd things in Dawson, but also an important event to allow people to vote.
Okay, how great is that? Also, if you think about in Nunavut, there's a place called the Eureka Weather Station. So what happened there is that ballots were delivered by military plane. The plane was on the ground for something like 45 minutes, and everyone was basically able to finish their vote in about 20. For all of us here at The National, thank you for being with us. You can watch anywhere, anytime on the free CBC News app and subscribe to The National's YouTube channel. I'm Adrienne Arsenault. Take care.